So I got enough time to hit you guys one more. It turned out that it did not take me long to finish up my submissions for the weekend. So here I am. Oof, freshly carbonated. So, welcome to my dark room. And the scary topic of the evening is drumroll. Hold on, wait. Dang, I don't have a drum roll. I need a laugh track or something. Not a laugh track, but what do you call those things? Those McDougally things that you go. The horrible topic of romance. Oh, that did not work the way I wanted it to. Ah, romance. Ah, there we go. Well, I mean, it's somewhat working. So, the topic of romance. I don't know. I feel like torturing myself somewhat to stay awake. So, the topic of romance. Fundamentally, human societies and most of human mythology is a romance plot, right? Um, most of the most notable moments in history comes from romantic. Well, really, humanity is caused by romance. If you think about it, we're caused by reproductive efforts of other human beings. So to see abstractions of that process should not be, I don't know, how would I put it? Alien to us, foreign to us, reprehensible. And point is that we have this concept in our modern society that romance is dead, or that, oh, because of the current sexual dynamics, we will never be able to, form proper, traditional, the trad fam concept. But the thing is, I don't necessarily think the trad fam concept, at least from a Christian angle, is the concept of what relationships should be formed on in the first place. And this goes back to the idea of where do societies get their concept of romance from? And this is another reason why I would say that the social constructs or the religious beliefs or social faith that people develop in a society are important, and they shouldn't just be torn down without a regard for where they come from. In the classical Garden of Eden situation, you have this setup, um, these three different tracks for humanity that are set up. In other mythologies, you have the idea that people are built from clay, or they're built from blocks of wood, or they're born from the breath of the air, and that through the regarding of each other, there's this recreation of that process within the beings who are created. And in a sense, they develop the ability to create life after themselves. With there, we can form our first distinction for what we could say romance is. There are two conceptions of what romance could be. One would be romance as, you know, a illuminating force within a culture. That romantic subplots and archetypes are used by genders in order to establish relationships with one another to a set standard or to a social standard. The other side of romance would be the cardinal aspect of romance, where instead of looking for the grandeur fulfillment of a narrative or of an archetypical function, you instead have this substructure that is used to abstract different aspects of the ultimate good and repurpose them into a narcotic, in a sense. So rather than pursuing romance for the end result of creating a family and feeling the fruition of creating more humanity and shaping the future of our species, instead, the romantic subplot is I find the girl, I romance the girl, profit. There is the end of the you have the end of the movie where the guy gets the girl or the girl gets the guy and they have their happy ending. But we as a culture, in our society at least, we do not have a preference, unless you're watching television, to watch the after story. But the fact that we do have television shows that are based on a premise, I mean, again, Clark and Lois, or Lois and Clark. I forgot what that show was or how it went in the order. But the purpose of that show is showing the happily ever after isn't so happily ever after. And human in our society does have a craving for that. That reflects a loss of our literary background in society as Americans read less. We crave in our media sources, our more overt forms of entertainment, that same kind of persistence of narrative. And so even if you are to remove or abstract a good from its origin point, you still can never fulfill the longing that exists within that on a collective level. And that's why you get these mimicking of these situations on the abstracted level. So you end up with these subplots, like the new Superman subplot. That's not a condemnation against it. I'm explaining why these things are coming about. So romance does have a utility to society. Romance has an ontological establishment within our species, within how we psychologically utilize romance to organize ourselves among our fellow humans. Romance does drive a certain element of it, and you can even abstract this. Romance comes from the desire of fellowship, like I was saying in the last video. And there's an element of the romantic subplot in friendship. Um, this is why I would counter the notion that men and women can't be friends. It's not that men and women can't be friends, it's that what we mean by friends has to be changed in order for men and women to be friends. That is either changed into a more cardinal sense where we fulfill that which we feel. So if you like a guy, you like a guy. If you like a girl, you like a girl, and you just act upon it. Or we can filter it through necessity of function, which I would say is the best way of putting the traditional or the biological imperative theory or platform for it as. This idea that because this is what's best for the majority, this is what we say is proper for the majority. That has no bearing on what the minority does, but it does have a bearing for what the majority acknowledges and seeks to work from as the established standard for a society. And this is the conflict that we're in, is that we have these substructures that are competing for control of the infrastructures that we establish our society with. They believe that if they can control the infrastructure, they can then force these other subcultures to change. But that will only create animosity and oppression within those groups, which will then create a counter cycle. So, in order to prevent these cycles from happening, you have to work on an individual level, which leads to the idea of romance. Um, and societies change in the individual pursuit of romance. In a lot of ways, we are far more individualistic in our romantic options than ever before. In the contrary, we are also more systematic and ritualistic in how we pursue partners. That is to our detriment, I would say. Um, we have put ourselves into this situation where we are reactive in how we form peer bond relationships. So how we bond with our peers um, is affected heavily by the schema we've adopted as children. So if you grow up as a Democrat, you tend to associate with people who, even if they don't know themselves are Democrats, more often than not, they're not going to be running around driving a pickup truck talking about how they're going to shoot a 12 gauge and how they can't wait till Reagan is reborn from the grave. You know, like as a Californian, you don't normally imagine Californians being gung ho about the Texan lifestyle per se. So again, that shows that in order for those two cultures to intermingle, there has to be shared norms or a process by which they can form a shared narrative. That's the same process by which Republicans and Democrats can unite or will be forcefully united, but also should be united. It should be done on the public level rather than on the federal level. but that's a whole side tangent for another video. To keep this video short, the point that I'm trying to make across is that in order to change the relationship dynamic between men and women and to get rid or change how we formulate our perception of gender and sexuality, we have to go back to the basics. But in order to go back to the basics, we have to also get back to the idea of what is the point of sexuality. Well, sexuality is the expression of the romantic impulse. Um, Again, because in order for things like homosexuality or transgenderism to be valid, because they remove the reproductive element from it, romance would still have to play a part. And this is the self-answering aspect of the question. Well, what do you do if you are impotent or infertile? Well, again, romance. Romance is still productive to the rest of the human species, and human beings fulfilling the romantic archetypes and narratives still establishes a stability and a representative order through having several members establishing a structure. People will see the structure and seek to strive to obtain that same kind of stability. So, by having people who fulfill that or sacrifice themselves for that purpose, you still are able to establish a good for humanity as a whole. So, there's still a purpose to having these things, even as a majority, even if there is a minority that is sizable that still wishes to enfranchise themselves. You can enfranchise the minority without sacrificing or compromising the majority standard that must be maintained in order for a species to propagate itself, but also to become more efficient. Um, in order to maintain the efficiency that we're trying to establish through technology and through scientific manipulation of our species, we're going to have to augment ourselves and we're going to have to use genetic manipulation. And in order to sustain ourselves, we're going to have to become more artificial as a species. I am a naturalist in that regard. I tend to reject a large amount of intrusion into the genome and the psychological imprinting of our species by collectivist groups. So I tend to promote a very down to earth, humanistic model of enfranchisement for subcultures into the larger society. I believe in assimilative models of enfranchisement. So the idea is that instead of trying to conquer and force people to transform to the image of a minority in order to feel valid, you instead win the majority over through self acceptance and self accountability. And it is for this reason that I decided to become a black Republican, as I would be identified as, considering that most people who call me racist would be wrong, considering I am African American. I know, where's your skin color? Screw you. Do not need at all to prove that. I have the genetics to prove it, and I certainly would be hung if I went back in time. So, yeah, I'm good. But the point of the whole exercise was that I wanted to understand whether or not, being African American, could I absorb conservative values and learn to apply them and see their value within the African American community. I have. I've seen sufficient performance value out of applying conservative values into African American communities as a whole rather than impartial. And so when African Americans adopt conservative archetypes and narratives, it's more beneficial for us as a collective than adopting Democrat narratives, which seem to have enfranchised us in a very victimized way. And it puts us in subservience to the federal government consistently, almost to a way, almost to the point where the soft expectations put across us as a race limits our ability to perceive ourselves as individuals capable of anything else other than the lives that we currently live. That is extremely debilitating. It's dehumanizing in a way that I don't think even the left could begin to understand. But once I was able to begin to conceptualize it, it turned me off to a lot of the racial conversations that the left was having and the Marxian undertones that were laying them with this vindictive hatred towards other cultures and societies and races that in a sense, had done wrong, but if when you really look into it, technically they should have the type of racism they have. I mean, again, if brown people were the Romans, and brown people were the Egyptians, and brown people were everybody other than the Europeans, and the Europeans somehow changed all of history in the last 400 years to enfranchise themselves as the rulers over the whole Western and Eastern world, well, that means that for the entirety of European history, while they were still fighting each other as groups of scattered tribes, a bunch of brown people systematically raped, pillaged, and slaughtered them and forced them to eventually unify against the rest of the world. So, who's guilty of what? Same dilemma if you really look at the Native American history. You have the Native Americans who basically isolated themselves in America to separate themselves from the empires that existed both in Canada and in Mexico and South America. So, Native American tribes that we consider the free living ones who always loved peace and all, even those guys were a minority in America. They were usually being shafted by everybody around them. Human history is full of people who have working against those who have not, and those who have not usually don't have many methods of getting those who have to actually give a damn about them. Christianity was very efficient at doing that. That's why people adopt Christianity. It's not so much that it's just, a easy way of controlling disenfranchised group or oppressed groups. It's actually beneficial for those groups to adopt them because it allows them to develop memes and norms that betray the rather low resolution or very ignorant worldviews of those who oppress them. So if you believe that racists are wrong, by performing the Christian meme, performing the archetype of Christ in the life of a racist, you betray their expectations and their way of understanding reality in a way that might disrupt it enough for them to form a new perception of self or of others that then can be used to attack their prejudice and change it. It's the same thing in romance as well. That's why we try to project the best image of the self. Nobody goes up to the girl they're interested in and talks about how they crapped themselves. I don't know. Or how they threw up on themselves at a party one day. If it comes out as a funny story later on once you establish that rapport. And again, that would be done for a purpose. I mean, it's not to make this thing sound manipulative, though inherently most of our processes of interacting with each other tend to be, um, which is a problem for people who have my kind of proclivity of overthinking because you then start to understand just how many conversations you don't want to have because there's no way to avoid wanting to stimulate somebody to have the interaction or reaction that you want them to have. I mean, that's just a natural thing. This is why I think this whole fanaticism towards a narcissistic element, while beneficial because there are narcissists out there in the world that we have to combat, Lord knows I've had to fight plenty in my life, to say that there are certain people who are narcissistic is wrong because most people in humanity are narcissistic and we need narcissism in order to become extroverts. Most people who are not extroverts lack the narcissistic elements of themselves to perceive in itself that should be received by other people or should express themselves to other people. There are many different ways of hashing that kind of abstraction. The goal of romance is to bring yourself into the regard of another person in a way that allows them or stimulates within them the desire to receive you into themselves. And from that, you produce a good, a product, a commodity, a influence. Whether it's you go on dates and thus your loneliness is assuaged, or you get sexual gratification and thus your lust is assuaged, or you have a friend and you thus can have somebody to go out to talk about the office with, and thus your companionship urge is assuaged. These things have a process, and thus it is a form of interaction that has contracts that you can form between people in order to streamline this receiving of the good. Now, going from that idea that there is a contract that can be formed between individuals, there's a competition between individuals for the good or the reception of this good as received by the supplier. But going even further, there's a marketplace, and this is where we get the idea of the sexual marketplace and the influence of the sexual evolution upon it. Romance has been heavily influenced by sexual evolution in that it changed the sexual marketplace and it reestablished certain Darwinistic norms that if we evolved from apes, you have to understand, would thus be impressed upon the rest of our species. So the idea of hegemony or of the idea of pump it and dump it, these things are hard set conditions within the human species that could not be changed, but have to thus be altered for the creation of social constructs and biological imperatives or biological forms of biological accountability. So social pressures would be a form of biological accountability in a sense. Having a social construction would be an attempt to create a biological form or a biological accountability within an individual by impressing upon them a set of standards um, through an archetype. So the idea is that if you want to change people, if you want to influence people, you have to set in them an example of what you want them to do or be. And that has happened throughout the 20th century, where we established these romantic subplots or sub narratives that, in a sense, because they're cut off, they allow us to create our own. We live in a sexual buffet, in a sense. But in this sexual buffet, not everybody has equality or equity. We don't have access to equal opportunity and we don't have access to equal outcome within this sexual buffet. The creation of a sexual marketplace was intended to originally prevent that, but once we started to break down the contracts that could be formed and regulate how these contracts were formed and for what purposes they would be enfranchised by the greater society, that's when you saw the breakdown of the sexual marketplace and the creation of a sexual capitalism. So now that we have sexual capitalism, we now have a sexual marketplace where human beings use their bodies, their emotions, and their words, how they present themselves and express themselves, as a form of capital to win over mates or partners, or especially life partners, to various effects and for different purposes and to different priorities. Things like arranged marriage and stuff like that were attempts of creating a sexual marketplace. So the hatred towards, actually, ironically enough, arranged marriages are a form of sexual socialism. Everybody receives a spouse, everybody receives a partner, everybody stays within their lane, and it is prescribed for a form of federalized or centralized distribution of reproductive identity and roles and partnerships. So, ironically enough, people who hate um, this form of sexual socialism prefer sexual capitalism, but hate economic capitalism and prefer economic socialism, which is an oxymoron. Through socialism, you can actually promote sexual socialism easier, and that is why oftentimes societies tend to do so. Um, in this current age of artificial societies, we have the ability of mixing and matching these naturally arising or biologically linked patterns within our society, and we can now mix and match them based off of our subgroups, because now subcultures have a much bigger sway over the majority because they're not being canceled out through social Darwinism. Again, the irony of having these beliefs like social Darwinism, economic Darwinism, all that kind of stuff, which underlies so much of the socialist mentality and the anarchist movements and the anti-federalist movements in society, ironically enough, also would be what you use in order to create the tyrannies that we're currently fighting against. So once you start hashing it down, a large part of our problems came from the original corruption, and the only way in order to beat it is to rely on the children of the corrupted, which is a recipe for disaster. Again, don't go to Hollywood to solve the romance issue. They're the ones who ruined it. So in order to change Hollywood and romance in general, we, the people, have to have a different demand on the supply. We have to go to a different supplier. Religion offered an aspect of that that I don't think it can equally provide now. So the demand is higher than the supply. That what the the preferences and variations preferred are so vast within the marketplace that competition is non-existent. It's not so much that there's so much competition, it's that there's a lack of composition from which competition can be streamlined and used to actually produce new and innovative forms of romance to compete with these rather macabre and low productivity based relationships that form. I mean, again, often our relationships are a representation of our desire to have an identity rather than a manifestation of our identity as it is actualized within our environments. More often not, we are what we want our partner to see us being, rather than what our partners actually acknowledged us being through seeing us in realistic engagements with other people. So perhaps the answer, just like with politics, the answer being going for the middle, going and forming a all-me option. Same thing for romance. We need not a new romanticism or a new romantic movement, but instead we need a return to a loving movement, a concept of love that is not just love everybody, bro, or well, don't judge me if you love me, bro, but actually means like this is what it means to love another. To do is to love. So we are performing love rather than receiving love or selling love. We need to get to the point where love is a production of our society rather than a commodity by which we trade other goods that are produced within our society through. Okay, yeah, I'm reaching the end of being able to talk. Either way, there you go. That's my insight on that stuff. I leave that with you all. Stay blessed, stay alive, don't die. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all later. Peace. Woody doody 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 boop. Boodly doodly boop. Toot toot doodly doodly boop. Boop boop boodly boop. Boodly 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 boop. Boodly boodly boop. Boodly 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 boop. Boodly boop.
When I was but a young man, I was wild and full of fire, a youth within my teens, but full of challenge and desire. I ran away from home and left my mother and my dad. I know it grieved them so to think their only boy was bad. I fell in with an outlaw band, their names were known quite well. How many times we robbed and plundered, I could never tell. This kind of sinful living leads only to a fall. I learned that much and more the night I heard my master call. One night we rustled cattle, 1,000 head or so, and started them out on the trail that leads to Mexico. But a norther started blowing and lightning flashed about. I thought someone was calling me, I thought I heard a shout. Then at that moment lightning struck not 20 yards from me, and left there was a giant cross where once there was a tree. And this time I knew I heard a voice so sweet and strange, a voice that came from everywhere, a voice that called my name. So frightened I was thinking of sinful deeds I'd done, I failed to see the 1,000 head of cattle start to run. The cattle they stampeded were running all around. My pony ran but stumbled, and it threw me to the ground. I felt the end was near, that death would be the price, when a mighty bolt of lightning showed the face of Jesus Christ. And I cried, oh Lord, forgive me, don't let it happen now. I want to live for you alone, oh God, these words I vow. My wicked past unfolded, I thought of wasted years, when another bolt of lightning killed 100 head of steers, and the others rushed on by me, and I was left to live. The master had a reason, life is his to take or give. A miracle performed that night, I wasn't meant to die. The dead ones formed a barricade, at least 6 or 7 high. Right behind it there was I, afraid but safe and sound. I cried and begged for mercy, kneeling there upon the ground. A pardon I was granted, my sinful soul set free. No more to fear the angry waves upon life's stormy sea. Forgiven by the love of God, a love that will remain. I gave my life and soul the night the Savior called my name.
Oh, well, the sun will go down. Celebration in the town tonight. All day long, they've been slaughtering upon the stone. Share out the meat. Yeah, you really like to eat. Come on, woman, come, follow me home. Oh, well, the priest, he cried, Virgin ascending to the skies tonight. All day long, I passed my time. When the church bell rung, stayed up on the tower in the dying sun. Now come on, woman, come, follow me home. share the feast. So drink up my wine, yes, and the song in my bones. I know the way, I can see by the